Okay, so we are doing Unit 9, which is the cardiovascular system, but specifically just the heart. And the terms that you guys are responsible for knowing are on page 137, all the terms in those green boxes. There will be a quiz on those terms in 1 week on Monday, April 13th. Again, I'll open that quiz up at 8 a.m. And then your pages, which are worth 5 points, are there. You should fill in those pages, take a picture of them, and those are also due by next Monday. So this is a look at your heart. In anatomical position, the right side of the heart will be located where the superior and inferior vena cava enter into the right atrium. So the right and left side of the heart will always be in anatomical position for how they would sit on a person. A little bit of overview about the cardiovascular system. We talk about the heart as the center of that system. It's nonstop pumping, averaging about 75 beats per minute. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry blood back to the heart. And the arteries and veins entering and leaving the heart are called the great vessels. The valves within the heart ensure its blood flow is unidirectional, and that just means that heart goes in one direction and it doesn't go back to a chamber that it came from. This is important so that blood pressure and cardiac output can be maintained. If blood does go back to a chamber it shouldn't be in, that usually signifies there's a problem with a valve, and we call that a heart murmur. Simply put, your heart is a two side-by-side pumps that work at the same rate and pump the same volume of blood. One pump directs blood to your lungs where it picks up oxygen, and one pump directs blood to your body tissues where it delivers oxygen. The heart generates blood pressure through these alternative cycles of contracting and relaxing, and blood pressure is the force of the blood pushing against the inside walls of the blood vessels, which is essential to circulate blood throughout the body. There's two types of circulations within the body. So the heart pumps blood through the pulmonary circulation, where blood will start in the right side of the heart and it will pump deoxygenated blood through your pulmonary arteries to your lungs. And after oxygen pickup and carbon dioxide release, the pulmonary veins return blood to your left side of your heart. And then the systemic circulation is when the left side of the heart pumps oxygenated blood through your systemic arteries to the body's cells, where nutrients, respiratory gases, and wastes will be exchanged, and then your systemic veins carry the blood back to the right side of the heart. And this is just a picture describing kind of these two types of circulations. Blood will enter as deoxygenated blood to the right side of the heart, leave through your pulmonary arteries to pick up blood, and then oxygenated blood will enter into your left side of the heart before it gets pumped out through your aorta through to your systemic circulation. The position of the heart, it's located slightly left of the midline, deep to your sternum in a space called the mediastinum. Your heart is slightly rotated, so the right border is located more anteriorly and your left border is located more posteriorly. Because it's rotated within the mediastinum, it sits kind of back on itself on what we call the base, which is its posterior superior surface, which is mainly made up the left atrium. The superior border of the heart is formed by your great arterial vessels and the superior vena cava, which we will look at a picture of soon, and the apex is the inferior conical end, and the inferior border is formed by the right ventricle. This is a look at the position of the heart as it lies inside of your body, and remember again, the right border and left border are always in anatomical position. So the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart are always how the heart would sit in your patient. The pericardium makes up a tough sac that the heart is enclosed within. It restricts heart movement so that it moves only slightly within the thorax. It's composed of two parts, your fibrous pericardium and then your serous pericardium, which is composed of the parietal and visceral layers. Between the parietal and visceral pericardium layers, you have what we call a pericardial cavity, which is a thin space of serous fluid. And this is a look at those layers. If you can kind of zoom in and see this picture here, the fibrous pericardium makes out the outermost layer, and then the parietal and visceral layer make up the serous pericardium with the pericardial cavity in between. The visceral layer of your serous pericardium is also what we call your epicardium, because then from there we have the myocardium, which is the thick muscular layer, and the endocardium, which is your internal surface of the heart chambers. And here's a description of those three layers from superficial to deep, remembering that the epicardium is that visceral layer of serous pericardium. And here is another inner look at those three layers. You can see the myocardium is the thickest muscular layer of cardiac muscle, and that's where we get the branched histological views of the heart that we're familiar with those intercalated discs. So let's first look at the heart from an external point of view, and then we'll look inside the heart. Your heart is composed of 4 hollow chambers, 2 superior, smaller atria on the top, and 2 inferior, larger ventricles on the bottom. The anterior part of each atrium forms what we call an auricle. That's just a piece of tissue that resembles an auricle shape. Think of the auricle of your ear. The right atrium feeds the right ventricle, which will feed the pulmonary trunk into what we call pulmonary circulation, and the left atrium feeds your left ventricle, which feeds your aorta into what we call systemic circulation. Your coronary sulcus is a groove separating your atria and ventricles, and then you have an interventricular sulcus on the anterior and posterior sides of the heart, and those are located between your right and left ventricles. So this is a look at the exterior surface of the heart. You can see your right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, and left ventricle are in bold. Your superior vena cava and inferior vena cava both bring deoxygenated blood to your right atrium. That's why they are in blue. Your pulmonary trunk splits into left and right pulmonary arteries, bringing deoxygenated blood from your right ventricle to your lungs. And then once the blood picks up oxygen in the lungs, it returns back to the heart as your left pulmonary vein and right pulmonary vein into your left atrium. From the left atrium, blood goes into your left ventricle, and from your left ventricle, that oxygenated blood then gets sent out through the systemic circulation through your aorta into the tissues of the body. From here, you can see a cadaver view of the external heart anatomy, and it's always nice to remember that this is what your heart actually looks like, not the nice red and blue colors that you saw in the previous picture. From a posterior look at the heart, you can see how the left ventricle and left atrium are more on the posterior side. The left atrium forms the base of the heart, and you can see here where the right and left pulmonary veins enter into your left atrium, bringing that oxygenated blood back from the lungs, and how your right and left pulmonary arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. It's also neat here, you can see where the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava enter into that right atrium. Again, a cadaver view of the external heart anatomy. Then we'll look at internal heart anatomy. Again, the heart has 4 hollow chambers: right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Between those chambers and entering into the great vessels, we have 4 valves. And again, the valves help ensure that blood only flows in one direction. You have 2 atrioventricular valves that are between atria and ventricles, and 2 semilunar valves at the base of the great arteries. The closure of the atrioventricular valves causes your first heart sound that you'd hear in a stethoscope, and the closure of the semilunar valves causes the second heart sound that you would hear in a stethoscope. So there's a lot going on in the internal view anatomy of the heart, and I'll try to cover everything that's on your list here, but feel free to go back to this PowerPoint on Canvas if you need to review it. So we're going to start within the right atrium. There's a little depression called the fossa ovalis. It's kind of this shaded circular part in the right atrium. That's a remnant of a hole that existed between your right atrium and left atrium in fetal development. When the lungs of a fetus aren't properly developed, the blood will bypass going to the lungs and go right from the right atrium to the left atrium through that fossa ovalis. At birth, when you take your first breath, that intake of breath causes a pressure increase to slam shut the fossa ovalis with a thin sheet of tissue. You can also see pectinate muscles, which are tiny ridged muscles in the atria. So that is your atria. You can see the opening for your inferior vena cava and superior vena cava entering into the right atria. And then you see the cusp of this right atrioventricular valve. It's also called the tricuspid valve. So this is your right atrioventricular valve as the tricuspid valve. It's attached to what we call papillary muscles, which are these muscles that look like little ridges in the ventricles. So the ventricles have these papillary muscles which control the opening of the valves with what we call chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae are the thin white kind of pieces of string that are attached from the papillary muscles to the valves itself. The tricuspid valve, the right atrioventricular valve, is called tricuspid because there's 3 cusps to it where it opens and closes. If we move over kind of still in the right ventricle, the semilunar valve, pulmonary semilunar valve, controls blood flow into the pulmonary trunk as blood flows from your right ventricle into your pulmonary trunk to the lungs. And then peeking out here, if we move over to your left ventricle, the atrioventricular valve between the left atrium and left ventricle is called your left atrioventricular valve, also known as your bicuspid valve. And same thing, you can see the papillary muscle attached to the chordae tendineae, which will pull on the cusps of that bicuspid valve to open it. We also have what we call trabeculae carneae, which are ridges within the ventricles. And sneaking out here, it's hard to see from this angle. You can see the aortic semilunar valve, and that valve will open and close, allowing blood flow into the aorta from the left ventricle. What else am I missing here? I'm just taking a second to look at your list. I know that was a lot of information, so some of this you'll have to review on your own. Let's keep going because some of my slides will explain a little bit more in detail what I just told you. Here's not the best view of the internal anatomy of the heart. It's easier to look at what someone drew, but again, this is what you guys look like. Here are the heart valves, where they're located and their structure and function. So this is a good chart to review. The right atrium receives venous blood from the heart and systemic circulation through 3 veins: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and then the coronary sinus, which is located on the posterior side of the heart, which I'll show you a picture of. The interatrial septum, septum means wall, so this is a wall that divides your right atrium from the left atrium. Pectinate muscles are ridges on the internal surface of the atrial walls, and the right atrioventricular valve, the tricuspid valve, ensures one-way blood flow from your right atrium to your right ventricle through its opening. The right ventricle receives deoxygenated blood from your right atrium. The interventricular septum is a thick wall between your right and left ventricles, and the inner wall of each ventricle displays irregular muscular ridges called trabeculae carneae. The right ventricle, as well as the left ventricle, has what we call papillary muscles, which are cone-shaped muscle projections anchoring the chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae were those thin, kind of string-like structures that attach the muscle to the atrioventricular valve and prevent the cusps from flipping into the atrium when the ventricular contracts. The conus arteriosus is a smooth funnel-shaped region at the superior end of the ventricle that leads to your pulmonary semilunar valve, and that pulmonary semilunar valve will ensure one-way flow from your ventricle into the pulmonary trunk. Your left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Your left atrioventricular valve, also known as the bicuspid or two-flap valve, controls flow through the opening between your left atrium and left ventricle, and the valve is forced shut when the left ventricle contracts so that blood will be pushed out of the ventricles through the aorta. Your left ventricle pumps blood through the entire systemic circulation. It'll generate extremely high pressure. So because your left ventricle is kind of the powerhouse, it pumps blood to the rest of your body, it will have the thickest walls out of any chamber. And the aortic semilunar valve controls flow from your left ventricle to the aorta, and it's located at the superior end of the left ventricle. Here's just a comparison of the right and left ventricular wall thickness. You can see how your left ventricular wall is about 3 times thicker than the right. And again, that's because it's the pumping action from your left ventricle is what is pumping blood to systemic circulation. The heart itself needs blood and oxygen to function. So your coronary circulation refers to right and left arteries that travel within that coronary sulcus or groove and supply the heart wall with oxygen and nutrients. They will branch off the ascending aorta just superior to your aortic semilunar valve, and you can see those listed there. You'll have a right marginal artery, a posterior interventricular artery, and then an anterior interventricular artery. It's also called your left anterior descending artery. This is the most common site for blockages within the heart, and then you'll have a circumflex artery. So this is a look at that left anterior descending artery. In a heart attack, if one of these arteries gets blocked and a part of the heart can't receive oxygen that it needs, it'll shut down or break or tear, and that's what a heart attack is, some sort of breaking down of heart muscle tissue. How do we fix a blockage within one of these arteries? A stent can be inserted, which is a little teeny tiny piece of mesh, and then it'll be kind of enlarged to try to enlarge that artery to get blood flow through that blockage. Coronary circulation has to do with venous return of blood from your heart wall, and it occurs through 3 major veins, the great, middle, and small cardiac veins. These 3 major cardiac veins will all drain into the coronary sinus, which you can see on the posterior side of this heart view. And that coronary sinus will drain into the right atrium. And this slide just describes a little bit of those coronary circulation veins. Contraction of heart veins, of the heart muscle itself, occurs as a single unit between muscle fibers because they're all connected with gap junctions, which are parts of intercalated discs, which allow each electrical impulse to be distributed immediately and spontaneously throughout the entire myocardium. And this brings us to kind of the last part of the terms that you need to know. You should know about the heart's conducting system. Heart exhibits autorhythmicity, where it initiates its own heartbeats, and the conducting system consists of specialized cells that start and propagate the electrical impulse to the contractile cells of the heart. It begins with the sinoatrial node, or the heart's pacemaker. The SA node is located here in the superior location of the right atrium. It travels then to the atrioventricular node located between atria and ventricles, through the bundle of His, or the atrioventricular bundle, down the interventricular septum to the right and left bundle branches, and into the Purkinje fibers. And again, this is just the heart's conducting system, the way it establishes its own heartbeat by sending out electrical signals to all the contractile cells. What this means is that if we were to remove your heart from your body and place it on a table, it'll continue beating by itself. This gives you a little more explanation to the heart's conducting system. Again, the electrical impulse begins at your SA node, and then from there the impulse travels to the AV node on the floor of the right atrium. The impulse leaves your AV node, enters the atrioventricular bundle or bundle of His, and then the bundle divides when it is in the interventricular septum into left and right bundles, and eventually pass the impulse to the Purkinje fibers that begin at the heart apex. And the Purkinje fibers spread the impulse superiorly from the apex to all of the ventricular myocardium, or cardiac muscle cells. And these final slides take you through the 5 steps of passing of this conduction system from your SA node to your AV node to the bundle of His, to the left and right bundle branches, and then to the Purkinje fibers.